Hallucinogens alter your sensory perception in several different ways. It can either be auditory, usually it's auditory, sometimes it's visual. Well, it's usually actually visual. you start having hallucinations. The three major hallucinogens, actually marijuana is a hallucinogen, but it's not as severe as these three. LSD is a synthetic hallucinogen. Mescaline, of course, is peyote, and psilocybin is magic mushrooms, the mushroom family. Okay, so the major one is one that they discovered by looking at a fungus that grows on grains. Lysergic acid diethylamide, also known as LSD. They synthesized it from this fungus, and as it turned out, the fungus was hallucinogenic. LSD creates an amazing effect by acting on select serotonin receptors, but researchers are not exactly sure why. LSD seems to have different effects for different people. It mirrors serotonin. Its chemical structure is very similar to serotonin, so it occupies serotonin receptor sites. A lot of times you get crossover where you are hearing colors and seeing sounds and whatnot. And for that reason, of course, it's a hallucinogen. It creates all kinds of interesting visual and actually you can taste colors. It's really kind of bizarre. I've never used LSD, of course, but I've talked to a lot of people that have. Oh, man, unfortunately. Another synthetic hallucinogen is phencyclidine, PCP. It was developed as an analgesic and anesthesia. It works really, really well. I mean, this stuff really can knock you out, take the pain away. The problem is that the side effects are really extreme, and for that reason we stopped using it on humans, but we continue to use it on animals in veterinary clinics. And somehow somebody found it, and it became a street drug. It's relatively simple to make, unfortunately. Anybody with any chemistry background can make these drugs. It makes, even at low doses, it makes the individual combative, and we're not exactly sure why. It also causes catatonia to some extent. They feel no pain, but sometimes they are overly excited, so you can't stop them. They'll just run through the streets, and sometimes, of course, they feel no pain, and for that reason, of course, we call it catatonia, and they're very combative and very catatonic, as it were. It comes in several different forms. It's either in a white powder. You can dissolve it in water and make it into a pill. It is when you put water with it, it turns into a black gummy substance, and you can take it that way. It's usually smoked with marijuana. They put it on marijuana. It's as a powder. They sprinkle it on marijuana, and that's how they get high. Now the question is, how much PCP is there in that doobie that you're toking? How much PCP is in there? And of course, they're not really sure because they're stoned anyway. The marijuana does tend to mellow these individuals out to some extent, but marijuana actually lasts a lot longer than PCP does. This stuff stays in your system for a while, for a couple days. Marijuana, of course, stays in your system for 28 days. And hopefully you have only put a little bit of PCP on that marijuana, and you're not going to have a negative reaction. This is what we see a lot. We see this where people will sprinkle it on marijuana, and they normally don't have very much of a reaction because they have two reactions going against each other. inside their system. And usually the marijuana wins out because they've smoked a lot more marijuana than they put the PCP in there. If they grab a hold of too much PCP and sprinkle a little bit more than they meant to, then they can become combative to the point, and you can't hurt them. That's the strange part. People on PCP, you can break their arm and they will still attack you with that broken arm. They feel no pain. So if they get a little bit too much PCP, now we got a problem. Now we got a really serious problem, because not only is this person impervious to pain, but we also have a situation where they are extremely combative. So they tend to be relatively paranoid from the PCP. PCP antagonizes the NMDA receptor and stimulates the release of the transmitter dopamine. Dopamine, of course, makes you feel pretty good. Research shows that possibly PCP acts on the prefrontal cortex and produces transient psychosis. Of course, we've got a lot of amphetamines that are causing exactly the same problem. Research with animals also shows a degeneration of the hippocampus and the cingulate gyrus. So if you take too much PCP, your memory becomes affected, and the cingulate gyrus is the area that is affected by ADHD. So here we've got what you're doing by taking PCP is making yourself, giving yourself dementia, and you're making yourself have ADHD. What a wonderful thing. Here, let's take some drugs that make us crazy, and not only make us crazy, but then we can't remember anything, and then we will act agitated all the time. How much fun is that? One of the newest street hallucinogens is the European rave drug Ecstasy, also known as MDMA. The drug is a combination of amphetamine and hallucinogen. What a wonderful combination. And it affects the serotonin-producing neurons in the brain. So it makes you feel good to an amazing extent. People who are on the rave drug, they are relatively catatonic. It's really kind of fascinating because they can be hypnotized by the movement of light. So a lot of times these individuals will go to a concert where they're having a light show, and they'll just stand there and be hypnotized by the lasers flipping back and forth. As odd as that seems, or not odd. Anyway, there's what your brain looks like on ecstasy. This is brain on ecstasy. This is your brain after ecstasy. As you can see, it's very activated. And now, of course, all of this has to do with serotonin. The serotonin receptors firing. We're going to talk about what happens afterwards in just a second. MDMA, while it has a calming effect during its use, may actually be creating a state of excitotoxicity if it's used too frequently. Animal studies have shown marked decreases in serotonin axons after use, and this is the biggest problem. So yeah, you feel great while you're taking this stuff, but you're actually destroying your serotonin-producing cells. Neurons in your brain. Okay, so now you had this really great experience where you loved everybody. Literally, you didn't physically love them, but you loved them in your mind. But afterwards, of course, since it destroys axons that produce serotonin, now you can't feel happy anymore, as odd as that seems. This is not that popular in the United States. It is around, but in the United States, we don't see it as frequently as they do in Europe. In Europe, it's all over the place. It is all over the place. I was teaching at Mississippi University for Women. We had a lady from Switzerland that was a raver. She was a raver when she was in Europe. Bounced all over. Amsterdam's a big town for raves. Berlin's a big town for raves. So not especially Paris. It's actually against the law in France, but in other countries It's legal, and she had used a large amount of it. This was the grouchiest lady I've ever been around. I mean, she would, you couldn't get her to smile. I mean, it was terrible. She spoke 4 different languages. Of course, she's Swiss, so she speaks German, she speaks French, Italian, and then she spoke and English was her 4th language. But she also spoke actually 5 languages. She spoke a language that is particular to Switzerland, Helvetian. So it was really kind of interesting. Or not that interesting. Anyway, she's the grouchiest lady I've ever been around. She could not be happy. You could not make that lady happy. There's nothing you could do to make her smile. She was... So potentially what happened was that she had used MDMA so much that she had destroyed her serotonin producing cells, and she didn't have the ability to be happy unless she was on MDMA, as sad as that is. Okay, MDMA. So MDMA is really kind of dangerous if you think about it, because it destroys your happiness. Addiction to nicotine, alcohol, and drugs injures the community by running up medical expenses and causing people to die prematurely. If we don't believe it, all we need to do is look at all the rock stars who were doing drugs, sex, and rock and roll over most of their lives. A lot of these individuals, some of them overdosed. Michael Jackson, Prince, or they died young, like David Bowie. Why in the world would he only live into his 60s? That doesn't make any sense. A lot of these individuals, and some of them die in their 20s. The guitar player, who am I thinking of? Black guy from Seattle. Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin died like within weeks of one another from exactly the same thing.
I think there's talk a little thing about there's like Jimi Hendrix, and then Janis Joplin, and then Jim Morrison. Jim Morrison we always joke about it with bartenders and stuff. There's a book about it, and he would say, well, you're drinking with number 3. He would say that to the bartender, because these celebrities are dying like in a row.
1, 2, 3.
Yeah, he would joke about it, and you're drinking with number 3. I guess it's 27.
They died at 27. That's so stupidly young to be overdosing on whatever. Who else? Whitney Houston, died after taking an insane drug cocktail. She drowned herself, and then her daughter did exactly the same thing. Died at 27. Her daughter did. Whitney was in her 40s when she died. Stupid stuff. Yeah, okay, so we know that it causes people to die prematurely. Even something that we may be legalizing in the future, of course alcohol does the same thing, but marijuana, we're going to have the same problems with marijuana that we've had with all the other drugs. Substance abusers commit crimes and they cause traffic accidents. This reservation's not nearly as bad, but reservations in Montana, it's dangerous to drive at night because you never know how drunk those guys are going to be in their interesting cars. The sad part about traffic deaths up north is the fact that they never drive alone. So they not only kill themselves, but they usually kill a whole carload of people, or they kill a couple people and then the others are maimed for life. I had a student that she was drinking. Everybody in the car was drunk, and she was in a pickup truck, and it was only a 1-seat pickup truck. I mean, they didn't have a back seat in it. It wasn't an extended cab, but there were like 6 people in the truck. There were like 6 people in the truck, and she had an accident. She killed herself. All the people on the outside died. So she died because she was driving, and the other lady that was over by the window died, but the 4 in the middle didn't die because they couldn't move. They didn't have on their seat belts. Well, there were only 3 seat belts for 6 people. but the 4 in the middle didn't die. But you know, they all hit the windshield since nobody was wearing a seatbelt, and everybody was really drunk. So the people on the outside died. The people on the outside died because they were ejected from the vehicle. They flew out the window. Anyway, so they commit crimes, and they commit traffic accidents. The cost of helping addicts control their addiction and that of controlling drug trafficking is very high. This is one of the reasons that, it's one of the reasons that Trump says he wants to build a wall, is to stop all the drugs from coming across the border. I don't think the wall's going to do it. Babies born to women using addictive substances impairs their brain growth. That's the most tragic thing in the world. You can't get the lady to stop drinking. You can't get the lady to stop taking drugs. I told you about my niece, my great niece. She was addicted to heroin. She was a heroin addict. And she got pregnant, and as soon as she got pregnant, she got arrested. And they took her to court, and she claimed that she was pregnant, so they couldn't put her in jail. That was her defense anyway. So they said, okay, we're not going to put you in jail, but we're going to put you on a maintenance program so that you can get off your heroin. So they put her on a maintenance program, these synthetic opiates that they gave her. But while she was taking these synthetic opiates, she was shooting up with heroin at the same time. So she was getting like a triple dosage of opiates. The entire time she was pregnant, and she smoked through the entire time while she was pregnant. She gave birth to a baby that was addicted so badly that it took them 6 weeks to wean the child off of opiates. As ugly as that is. It's really hard to say what's going on with the kid because the family is in denial. Their children can do no harm. It's my brother. Wow. This kid, and I warned my brother, you know, he will have an addictive personality. So you need to keep him away from everything. I mean everything. He's going to become obsessive compulsive about just anything. So you have to keep him away from cigarettes, you have to keep him away from alcohol, you have to keep him certainly away from drugs. But this is a family where they do not tell their children what to do. So it's my great niece. My niece was the same way, and of course my great niece is a spoiled brat. So what's the probability this kid's going to turn out functional? Not at all. I mean, there's no possibility. They don't have a group of individuals that are smart enough to tell this kid no. That's the problem. And my brother's one of them, unfortunately. Love my brother to death, but he let his wife control the family. 20% of all deaths in the United States every year are related to smoking. I know, 20%. 100,000 of these are due to lung cancer, of the smoking deaths. Of course, they also die of COPD, they die of emphysema, they die of a lot of different things, but lung cancer is very common. How do you treat lung cancer? What is lung cancer anyway? Your lungs and your brains are the two most vascularized, I guess it would be the right word, vascularized areas in your body. And because of that, controlling cancer in your brain and controlling cancer in your lungs is nigh on to impossible. There's just too much surface area to deal with. And same way with your brain. Your brain is extremely rich in protein and fat. And cancer just explodes when it gets into your lungs and when it gets into your brain. So if you have lung cancer, the probability of you surviving lung cancer is fairly remote. If you have brain cancer, the probability of being able to operate on it is not that good, but as long as it's on the surface, you can usually get to it. But if it's anywhere inside, it's almost impossible to treat. It's very difficult to treat. And we can do it, and we do it, but smoking cigarettes will kill you. Of people over the age of 55, smoking doubles the probability of dementia, especially Alzheimer's disease. About 125,000 deaths a year are associated with alcohol, many resulting from accidents and drunk driving, unfortunately, and of course that affects other individuals as well. I had a great aunt who was taking her grandchild to school one day, and a drunk driver passed out in his car going 60 miles an hour. How he stayed straight, I'm not exactly sure, but he ran through a four-way stop, slammed into her car, rolled it, and killed both my great aunt and my cousin, she like my third cousin or something. Yeah, he was 7-year-old and a 65-year-old woman. How much damage did it do to the individual, the drunk guy? None. Didn't have a scratch on him. Killed everybody else, but it didn't hurt him.
There was one on the news with a Navajo police officer in training in Phoenix metro area, and this bicyclist was coming back from work late at night. And he just destroyed that. This bicyclist never recovered. And nothing happened to the
Cars versus bicycles don't work at all.
the guy was he was one of the Navajo Nation police. I guess he was doing training out that way.
Not anymore.
He came back and that guess he destroyed that family.
I can imagine. 2 families are destroyed. There's a golfer by the name of Note Begay. I don't know if you remember him. Okay. He was in an accident where somebody was killed, and he was drunk as a skunk. And that was the last tournament he's ever played in. He hasn't played. You know, he still golfs, but he it destroyed his career. I mean, he was actually he trained with Tiger Woods at Stanford. Yeah, sad. 20,000 deaths a year are caused by illegal drugs, which don't seem to be a whole lot. Actually, the number has gone up to over 100,000. Why? Because people are overdosing on opiates, especially synthetic opiates and heroin. 8,000 more deaths are caused by drug-associated AIDS, and that's kind of an old figure. Scientists have been looking for cures of addiction for centuries. Many times treatments have been more destructive than the addictions themselves. A good example of that, the physicians in the 19th century used to treat alcohol addiction with laudanum. Laudanum is tincture of opium. Tincture means it's mixed with alcohol. So this is alcohol and opium put together. So they're trying to get you over your addiction by giving you alcohol and opium mixed together. So you can imagine how stupid this was. Edgar Allan Poe, Edgar Allan Poe was really sensitive to alcohol, to the extent that if he drank, he became extremely drunk, he became extremely aggressive. So you would think, well, just stay away from alcohol. But he lived in the South in the early 1830s, the early 19th century. And at that time, everybody drank, and it was a social thing to do. So he would go to a party or he would go to a meal, and he had to drink with the other people at the table. There was nothing else to drink. You had to drink alcohol. So he had a really serious problem. They gave him laudanum, and he was trying to... He actually went to West Point. Edgar Allan Poe went to West Point, and he was kicked out of West Point for drunkenness. As sad as that is. This wonderful author, as long as he stayed away from alcohol, he was functional. If he used alcohol, he wasn't functional. He died in his 40s. They found him on the street, and he was out of his mind. And they think it was because of laudanum. He was trying to cure himself of his laudanum. He published a magazine. And the magazine was starting to take off, and about that time they found him on the streets of Baltimore. Yeah, out of his head. Anyway, Coca-Cola, in the beginning, Coca-Cola was thought to be an alcohol substitute. It had cocaine in it, which is a stimulant, of course. But they eventually, in the early 20th century, they decided that cocaine was too dangerous, so they replaced the cocaine with caffeine. And one of the reasons, it was probably the most sugar that they had ever put in any drink. But the reason was because caffeine is actually very bitter. So is cocaine. It's relatively bitter. Excuse me. So they tried to use Coca-Cola as a replacement for alcohol. During World War II, we didn't give our troops beer or alcohol, but we did give them all the Coca-Cola they could drink, which was kind of interesting. Or not, I don't know. People became Coca-Cola addicts after that. But it was the caffeine that they were drinking.
Bruce, you went to Vietnam. Did they use the troops? Did the troops were delivered with
Beer?
Yeah.
Buckets of beer? Yeah, barrels of beer, you bet. Yeah, it wasn't the best beer in the world. It wasn't Vietnamese beer. It was American beer. Falstaff, I don't know if you've ever heard of Falstaff beer. They don't make it anymore, and it was cheap beer. That's the only stuff that I ever saw over there, but I guess other guys had Budweiser and, the good stuff. But we never got the good stuff. I don't know why. We were the ones, I was in the Air Force, and we were the ones transporting the alcohol. You would think that we'd be able to get whatever the hell we wanted, but all I ever saw was Falstaff beer. They used to make Falstaff beer all over the country. It was 3.2 beer, 3.2% alcohol. The flavor was, I don't know. I'm not much of a beer drinker anyway, so I never actually drank that much of it. But when you're thirsty, and they would give you two barrels of beer, and then they give you 1 barrel of pop, and it was usually Coca-Cola. I don't know why. Sometimes it was Pepsi, and people would complain that it was Pepsi. Coke has a very distinctive flavor. It's not the same as RC Cola or any of the other colas don't taste like nothing tastes like Coke. Coke has a very distinctive flavor.
That's like one of the it's like gold over in Europe. Coca-Cola.
They're not very well. Actually, the Coca-Cola they have in Europe doesn't have as much sugar in it as it does in the States. So, but the flavor is still the same. It's just not as sweet. Did you eat cake when you were in Germany? Their cake, their icing doesn't have hardly any sugar in it. It's just like, I don't know, it's like Crisco.
One of the strange things I saw was like in the morning we went down to brunch and I had tea, just sugar and tea, that's it. And I saw them put in milk with tea and I was like, is that coffee?
It's the Brits.
That is strange.
They put, it's half cream and half
tea. Yeah, like tea is like, okay.
As bizarre as that is. Since each drug has different effects on the nervous system, it is tricky to creating a single model of addiction, but that hasn't stopped anyone from trying, of course. The first model of addiction was the moral model. The religious people got a hold of the idea of we needed to stop these people from drinking. The temperance movement was a moralistic model. You're sinning against God, that kind of thing. They blamed the abuser for having a lack of moral character. That was the problem. They thought that they were weak. And of course, nobody likes to be told that they're weak. Of course, if you go into a bar, everybody makes fun of you because you're not drinking as much as everybody else. So you were weak. Either you're weak when you went home, or you were weak when you went into the bar. So you had a choice as to who you're going to get yelled at today. This model was based on an individual's need to ask for divine intervention to throw off the addiction. This was a time when everybody was religious in the United States. It's the time when they decided that in order to save the American Indian, that they would have to Christianize everybody. Of course, they had been trying to Christianize everybody from the beginning. North America was settled by people trying to get away from Europe, but at the same time, the way they were trying to get away from Europe was to declare a religious state. And this is one of the reasons they had so much trouble with religion over in Europe. You had people fighting each other because one was Protestant and the other was Catholic. They didn't want the same thing in the United States, so they kind of did away with that. But it didn't stop people from being overly moral or overly religious in the United States. We still had lots and lots of people that thought that this was the only way to save people. So they did that to the American Indians. Unfortunately, they decided that they needed to Christianize the American Indians. They needed to change the American Indians to Christian fellows. So it was really kind of an interesting situation. The whole divine intervention thing, this is in the early 20th century. The moral model was very popular. During the temperance movement, the moral model was very popular. The reason that they were able to pass prohibition was because of this concept that they needed to get God back into the concept of stopping people from drinking. Of course, that didn't work very well. Nobody likes to be told that they're not moral. So they decided, and this was in the 1920s. If you know anything about Alcoholics Anonymous, it started the disease model, Alcoholics Anonymous, because before that they told you needed to go to church and pray, and that's the way to get over your addiction. But then Alcoholics Anonymous started, and of course these were people that weren't that strong religiously, so they put together a 12-point program to keep people from drinking. And what they say in Alcoholics Anonymous is day by day. You need to take this one step at a time, one day at a time. And that's part of the disease model. So there was a problem with people responding to this extreme moralism of the individuals who were trying to cure people of their addiction. The disease model has a large number of adherents because it does not deal with guilt. Before they were telling everybody that they were bad, they were dirty, because they continued to drink. So there was a lot of guilt involved. They told them that they were weak because they couldn't stop. And of course, nobody likes to be called weak, and nobody wants to be told that they're guilty. And of course, the disease model sees the problem as chronic. They see it as a disease. The physical dependence model, wait a minute, is that all I'm going to say about the disease model? This is really kind of an interesting model because it has to do with doing away with the guilt, doing away with the weakness. The problem with the disease model is people don't take responsibility for what they've done in the past. That's the problem. Actually, one of the steps is calling people on the telephone and apologizing for hurting them. That's one of the steps. So you actually do take responsibility, but it teaches you that you don't have to be responsible for an extended length of time. So once upon a time in a land far, far away, I got a telephone call from my second wife, who was an alcoholic, who left me and my kids just one night. She just disappeared. And then a couple weeks later, we found out that she was filing for divorce. A couple weeks later, we found out that she wanted to get a divorce, so I got a divorce. I was the one who paid for it. And she was gone. She took off. But she called me, I don't know, it was about 10 years later. She called me on the telephone, And she apologized for leaving us. And that was her apologizing. Most people won't accept the apology. I mean, these people do a lot of damage. Alcoholics do a lot of damage. Alcoholics are huge liars. This lady was such a big liar that she was an alcoholic, but I didn't know it. That's how much of a liar she was. And she was using me to stop drinking because, well, I'm boring. Anyway, she was using me to stop drinking, and I had no clue that she was an alcoholic. We even had a drinking contest one night, and she only drank like 3 beers. Well, this lady could put down a whole 5th of Jack Daniels. As a matter of fact, that was her nickname, Jack Daniels Kid. That I found out later that her nickname was the Jack Daniels Kid. Actually, she told me before, and it didn't make any sense because she never drank, so it didn't make any sense that they call her the Jack Daniels Kid. And if I wasn't, dumb as dirt and blinded by her physical attributes, I probably would have figured out what the hell was going on. But I'm pretty damn stupid. I'll do whatever I need to do to make things work out. Anyway, it didn't work out. And eventually she called me on the phone, like I said, and apologized for hurting me and the kids. That's what she said. And at the same time, she asked me if I would impregnate her. That's what she wanted me. She wanted me to impregnate her. It turned out that she was sterile, but they fixed her. There was something physically wrong with her, and now she knew what her problem was, and she needed a semen specimen in order to impregnate herself. And she asked me if I would donate a specimen. And of course I didn't because, well, I didn't want to have a baby in Georgia someplace. Right, that didn't seem right to me. I mean, if I'm going to have a kid, I think I should take care of it, not only financially, but also emotionally and whatnot. Anyway, and I don't know whatever happened to her. Last time I talked to her, her kids were 2.5 years old. She had a set of twins. She had to have artificial insemination because of her problem, and so she had a set of twins, boy and a girl, just like I have, boy and a girl. And they were 2.5 years old at the time. That was, she says, before I went off to Montana. So that was 18 years ago. They must be going to college now.
Wow.
I don't know how to communicate with her. But I'm not real bright. I admit her physical attributes blinded me to any of her problems. The physical dependence model is based on the withdrawal symptoms that an individual may go through after they have used a select drug. Physical dependence. Drugs of abuse usually produce pleasurable feelings, of course. Otherwise, why in the world would you use them? I've told you the story of me drinking, and it wasn't a pleasurable experience. I vomited afterwards. I was depressed while I was drinking. I know, it only took me 3 times to figure out, duh, maybe I shouldn't do this anymore. Yeah, it didn't make me feel good, that's for damn sure. Withdrawal symptoms usually are the opposite effects of the effects produced when using the drug. For example, morphine is an analgesic. With intravenous use, it produces an orgasmic rush that leads to a state of serene, drowsy euphoria. And that's the reason people keep taking it. That's the reason why if a doctor tells you you need to take 100 milligrams of OxyContin, I don't know how much OxyContin you're supposed to take, you'll take 200 so that you get this orgasmic rush and this serene, drowsy euphoria.
What is euphoria? What is euphoria?
Oh, it feels so good, man. That's what it is. Feeling good. Well, I mean, like beyond anything you can possibly imagine. Withdrawal symptoms include irritability, tremors, and an elevated heart rate. Goosebumps appear, and the individual goes through episodes of temperature maladjustments. They have sweats and chills. Nausea is very common with opiates. As the individual progresses through withdrawals, the physiological changes that have occurred because of the drug to compensate for the drug affect the individual, of course. Withdrawal symptoms can be relieved by re-administering the drug, and it goes away almost immediately. Within 15 to 20 minutes, the individual has returned to a euphoric state. So the reason that it's so hard to get off of heroin isn't because the withdrawal symptoms are so bad. The reason it's so hard to get off of heroin is because the feelings that you get from the drug are so good. So people don't want to get off of it. They're going to be suffering for a number of months, maybe even years, wishing every day that they could take their drug because it's so euphoric. The feeling is so positive. I had one individual that told me that taking heroin was like dying, and you had no problems anymore, and you just let everything go. And he said that feeling of dying is the best feeling he's ever had, which seems a little odd because he wouldn't kill himself. No, but he no longer felt any worry, and it was that euphoria from not worrying anymore that made him want to take it over and over and over again. And he was in the military, and he was using in the military, which you're not supposed to do. Eventually, we did drug urines on people to find out if they were on drugs. I mean, we certainly didn't want military personnel out there with a nuclear weapon with the capability of firing this damn thing if they're stoked on something. Anyway, they caught it. We caught him. I was the one that collected the urine on him, and I knew that he was on heroin. They kicked him out of the service, of course. He didn't have his finger on the trigger. Don't worry. He was a lab tech. What a dummy. While some drugs have striking withdrawal symptoms, such as the opiates, others do not. Cocaine and marijuana, for example, have little to no physical withdrawal symptoms. Cocaine doesn't have any withdrawal symptoms because it doesn't stay in your system for very long. It only stays in your system for about 10 to 15 minutes. So because it dissipates so rapidly, there are no withdrawal symptoms. Marijuana, on the other hand, stays in your system for an extended length of time. So you toke today and you get stoned for about 4 or 5 hours because you smoke so much pot. Well, tomorrow, that marijuana is still going to be in your system. So it very slowly dissipates. And because of that, the withdrawal symptoms there are very few physical withdrawal symptoms. There are emotional withdrawal symptoms because now you want to be stoned again. You want to use it again. In the case of cocaine, the individual becomes psychologically dependent on the drug. This psychological pull is just as strong as a physical need that may be experienced by other substances. Crystal meth, methamphetamine, the synthetic stimulants, of course, they stay in your system for longer, and because of that, of course, their withdrawal is a physical withdrawal. The positive reward model came from animal research. Since animals are known to consume addictive substances in nature, researchers sought to discover if an animal could learn to take drugs. Using a simple direct feedback system, they discovered that animals learn to induce effects very rapidly. Researchers found that animals would engage in self-inducement even at levels that did not produce addiction. So they would seek the substance. A wide variety of addictive drugs release dopamine in the nucleus accumbens just as food does in a hungry animal. This dopamine originates in the area of the brain referred to as the ventral tegmental region of the midbrain. Ventral tegmental, right there. This area right here. So it creates what we refer to as the dopamine loop. It goes to the nucleus accumbens, and the nucleus accumbens is here, and then it goes into the hypothalamus, which is down here again. So it creates this loop, this dopamine loop. Starts at the ventral tegmental area, goes into the nucleus accumbens, and then it ends up in the amygdala and the hypothalamus. The amygdala, of course, has to do with emotion, so it makes you feel good. This dopaminergic pathway from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens serves as a reward system for many experiences. The addictive powers of drugs may come through stimulation of this dopamine pathway or dopaminergic pathway. Using a dopamine agonist reduces the cravings for these drugs. So if you use something that will take the place of that drug in the dopamine loop, then it will stop it, it will slow it down. And that substance is naltrexone. And that's what is out on the streets. We're having a really serious problem with people overdosing with opiates, with heroin. And because of that, all the police are carrying around naltrexone. And the naltrexone will block these, they will block the effect of the opiate. And we are saving lives many-fold. One of the problems was that the people that manufacture naltrexone realized that they could make a lot of profit. They can make a lot of money. Naltrexone used to cost about $40 a dose, which isn't too bad. It's kind of expensive, but it's not too bad. And then all of a sudden, they raised the price to $140 per dose. Yeah. Now, sometimes when somebody has overdosed, you need to hit them a couple times with naltrexone in order to get it to work. So whereas before that would be an $80 shot, now all of a sudden it was a $280 shot. I know. Somehow they got the drug companies to lower the price. So it's $60 a dose now. I know. I'm so excited. Biological factors. Males are more likely to abuse drugs than females are. Something going on with males. We can just insult each other and get each other to do stupid things like drink to excess. Females, not so much. There may also be a genetic predisposition. An alcoholic biological parent makes it more likely that a child will be addictive as well. Personal characteristics, aggressiveness, and tendency to act out emotional states are characteristics of drug abusers. They act like they're young. Your brain is arrested at the stage where you first start taking the drug. So if you are 12 years old when you start drinking, then your brain will never mature beyond age 12. Yeah. So you may be a 45-year-old man with a 12-year-old emotions. I know, it's stupid. So one of the things you need to think about when you're around a select individual that is a drinker is when did they start? And how are they going to react to things? One of the interesting things about my second wife was that she started drinking at a relatively young age, and she kept bouncing from guy to guy. Well, that's the way she did it in high school. That's the way a high school kid reacts. So unfortunately, a lot of this, the drinking, or a lot of the reactions we have from the drugs that people take, they have to do with adolescence, because that's when they started, and that's where their brains stay in adolescence. So this is something else that you need to think about when you're dealing with somebody who is an alcoholic, or somebody that's a heroin user, or somebody that uses crystal meth. The question that you really need to ask them is, when did you start? And if they started when they were 14 or 15 years old, then you can be assured that their brain has not emotionally matured beyond 14 or 15. That's just the way it works. So you're dealing with a teenager. In essence, you're dealing with a teenager. So in a lot of ways, drinking is an adolescent act, despite the fact that we've got all these people drinking wine and vodka and whatnot. All these older adults, it really all depends on when they started drinking, as to whether they're acting like a teenager or whether they're acting like an adult. If they started drinking as an adult, they probably don't like the flavor of alcohol. It doesn't taste good. It's a toxin. Why in the world would you drink it? It burns your tongue. doesn't it? It does burn your tongue. I know it burns your tongue. I haven't had a drink since 1976, but I remember it burns your tongue, okay? Personal characteristics, okay. Characteristics that negate abuse, school achievement, wanting to be successful in school, high educational goals, you want to get your PhD, and religiousness, depending on what religion that you practice. There are some religions, the Methodist religion, for example. Methodists don't drink very much. Baptists don't drink very much. Mormons don't drink at all. Well, Methodists aren't supposed to drink at all, and Baptists aren't supposed to drink at all. But if you're Catholic, you can drink all you want. The priests do, why can't you? So it really all depends on what religion you're talking about as to whether it keeps you from getting addicted or not. Factors related to drug abuse include divorce of parents and having an antisocial sibling. I had a friend who was brilliant. This man was brilliant, but his brother wanted to be his brother was a hippie, a beatnik. He wanted to be a beatnik. So he read things and he did things that were antisocial, relatively antisocial. So my friend, this was his older brother, he wanted to be just like his brother. So he drank like a fish. Unfortunately, he had diabetes. He had type 1 diabetes, and he died in his 30s because you can't do that if you're diabetic. You can't drink. If you drink, you're just accelerating the whole process of the debilitation caused by the diabetes. And that's what happened to my friend. Died in his 30s, in his early 30s. Died as an old man in his 30s. Yeah, because he wanted to be just like his brother Denny. Strong ties to parents protects against drug abuse. So the stronger your family structure is, the less likely that you will drink, especially if your family doesn't believe in drinking. That may be one of the reasons why I haven't had anything to drink since 1976. Neither of my parents drank. Let me get rid of this damn thing. There we go. Okay. Neither of my parents drank.
So that would be kind of a question too for someone, to ask if they came from parents that drank, right?
Right. Yeah. If their parents didn't drink, then they're probably drinking to be rebellious. Now that's something that you do when you're 15 or 16 or 17 years old.
Yeah.
But if you're 40 and your parents aren't around anymore, and you're still drinking to be rebellious against your parents, well, your brain has stopped.
At 15.
Yeah, at 15, exactly. So you've still got the same stupid ideas. Social and community factors, high prevalence of drug use in communities, especially by your peer group. So if you've got peers that are drinkers, if all of your friends are drinkers, if the individuals that you compare yourselves with are drinkers, then you will be a drinker as well. So peer groups are very important. This is in high school. That we're seeing this right now with the Brett Kavanaugh case. When he was in high school, he went to a high school where there was a lot of alcohol. Everybody was a drinker. They partied all the time. They partied a lot on the weekends and whatnot, and they were all relatively wealthy. But here they were drinking. And now the question comes up: did he really sexually assault that lady when he was drunk? He has admitted himself that what happened at his high school stayed at his high school. In other words, whatever you did when you were in high school, you never talked about again, or you never talked about somebody else. As interesting as that is. So on Monday, well, maybe not on Monday, but theoretically on Monday they're going to have a hearing to find out if he actually did sexually assault that lady, who eventually became a college professor. She has a doctorate in psychology, and she had to go to counseling because of this sexual assault. She's a research psychologist at Stanford and Palo Alto, California, University of California, Palo So she's highly touted, you know, a very accomplished individual. So now we're going to find out, we're going to figure out what happened, or maybe we won't. Is it okay as a 17-year-old to sexually assault a 15-year-old girl at a house party? Is that okay? Well, it's never okay. But if nobody talks about it, and what happens in high school never leaves the high school, well, we'll see what happens. Anyway, the peer groups at his high school in Maryland they were partiers, they were drinkers, and he was one of those individuals, evidently. Should be interesting to see what happens next. It is possible to stop on your own. You can stop drinking, you can stop smoking, you can stop taking drugs. Cold turkey. 90% of ex-smokers and 50% of problem drinkers seem to put on their own. We have all of these techniques to stop smoking. None of them work. Only about, you're dealing with 90% of people who just stop smoking on their own. Drugs for detoxification, drugs that control the withdrawal symptoms, and usually that would be a sedative to control the withdrawal symptoms. There are agonists of drugs that produce common addiction states. Methadone is used as an agonist. It is very similar to heroin. It's an alpha opiate receptor agonist that constrains the cravings for heroin. So methadone works, or can work. The antagonist to the addictive drug, that's naltrexone. Naltrexone actually works for anything. You can use naltrexone not only for opiates, but you can also use it for anything that excites the dopaminergic pathway. So we can use it with alcoholics. We can use it with people that smoke cigarettes. A little expensive to be using on smokers, but we can use it with methamphetamine abusers, if they have enough money, I guess. Anti-craving medications, substances that affect the desire for the drug. Antidepressants have been used with alcohol withdrawals, and that works. There are medications that block the drug metabolism. There's a drug called Antabuse that we give to alcoholics. If they take the Antabuse, then instead of producing acetaldehyde acetaldehyderase, it produces the acetaldehyde itself. And acetaldehyde is the same thing, is very similar to formaldehyde, and it causes the person to vomit. Evidently it's a horrible, horrible taste. It sure is a horrible, horrible smell when it comes out. It's like this person we put them in a vat of formaldehyde and they're vomiting this stuff out. It's nasty. It's just really bad. We had an individual that, this is such a bad situation. We had an individual where the wife wanted the husband to stop drinking. So the doctor agreed to give her Antabuse. And so she was slipping this guy Antabuse, especially on Friday nights, because he'd go out and get drunk. And he would stay drunk all weekend. He wouldn't come home all weekend. So she slipped him some Antabuse. And he would vomit. I mean, he would get deathly ill when he went to the bar. Well, he came in one night, and he came into the emergency room because he couldn't stop vomiting. And of course, he'd been vomiting for a number of hours, or for a number of minutes when we got him. But I'll tell you what, he smelled like somebody had just soaked him in formaldehyde. It was nasty because he was vomiting, and it permeated the entire emergency room. It was nasty. Eventually, of course, he sued the doctor, tried to sue the doctor. It was a military situation, so you can't sue military personnel. It just isn't the way it works. But he divorced his wife. And then he killed himself by drinking himself to death. He drank himself to death. What an idiot. Anyway, okay, this is what happens when you smoke a cigarette. You get what are we talking about? Nicotine surge when you take a puff. This is the puff right here, this pink line. And then it goes down. And this is one of the reasons why people have nicotine withdrawals when they smoke cigarettes. However, if you use chewing tobacco or you dip snuff, you get a surge as soon as you put the stuff in your cheek or gum or start chewing on it, and it stays relatively constant through the whole time you're using it. Okay, all right, and that's the end of the chapter. That's chapter 4, I think. Yeah, geez, I'm kind of behind. Well, this is the 5th week, so I'm going to start the 5th chapter 5 right now, just so I can say that I'm caught up. We'll pretend I'm caught up, okay? Chapter 5 is about hormones in the brain. How hormones work and how they function with as far as the brain is concerned. Animals use several different types of chemical signals in the body to communicate or deliver information. Neurocrine is synaptic communication, so it's we're talking about hormones here. Neurocrine, it's just information being passed from one neuron to the other. Autocrine hormone is activating the releasing gland. So an example of an autocrine would be the hypothalamus inducing the pituitary gland to release something. And the hormone that passes between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland would be an autocrine. Paracrine hormone is targeting a nearby cell, and sometimes a hormone will be released from one cell and it will affect a cell right beside it. This is the way it works with insulin. Endocrine hormone is passed through the blood to a distant target. So that would be the pituitary gland releases ACTH, and the ACTH affects the adrenal glands on top of your kidneys. So it starts in your brain, it flushes this stuff into your blood supply, and eventually it makes its way down to the adrenal gland. And it induces the adrenal gland to produce other hormones. A pheromone is a communication between an individual. A pheromone. So pheromones would be the passing of smells from one person to the other. And this works. We know this works because we can have a female dog that goes into heat. She'll start putting off pheromones. The pheromones will get into the air, and you'll have dogs from miles away that smell the pheromones, and they will go to this dog and try to breed, try to mate with her, so that she'll have their puppies. Pheromones. This is not only with dogs, it's also with cats. It works with a lot of different animals. I had a friend when I was at Ashford who worked with moths. He worked with moths, and he was trying to isolate the pheromone that moths put out, so that the moths know that the female moth is ready to mate. And so he did. He was able to isolate the moth pheromone. I know, he wrote a paper about it. Now this is really important. If you're a moth, this is really important. If you're a human, you're not thinking it's that important. Neurocrine communication is synaptic communication. This communication is highly localized, of course. So the neurocrine is one neuron releasing a hormone and interacting with another hormone, with another neuron. And so a lot of the neurotransmitters are actually hormones. I mean, if you look at the neurotransmitters that we have, a lot of them are actually hormones. In an autocrine cell, the secreted hormone is released by the cell and then finds receptors on their own cell to attach to, and that is how the autocrine works. It's released from one place and then it goes to another. Insulin works this way. Glycogen works this way. It is released, the hormone is released from one part of the cell and it affects another part of the cell. Paracrine cells release a chemical communicator that affects a nearby target cell. The strongest impacts are by the nearby cells, and of course insulin does this as well. It not only affects its own cell, but it also affects cells that are very close to it. Endocrine communication is through the release of a hormone into the bloodstream. The blood takes the hormonal signal to distant targeted organs where the hormone changes the function of the targeted organ. And of course, the example I gave you was pituitary gland releases ACTH. The ACTH goes down to the adrenal gland, and it induces the adrenal glands to release cortisol. Not only does it release cortisol, but it also releases steroids. What else does it release? It releases other substances as well. Hormones released into the environment are carried from their originator to another individual of the same species. Human females may release pheromones that regulate their menstrual cycles. We've discovered this by looking at sororities, by looking at groups of women living together. One of the things that happens with women when they live in proximity to one another, their menstrual cycles will regulate. In other words, when one person starts their period, they all will start their period in the near future. So they can actually regulate their menstrual cycles just by releasing of pheromones. Do humans actually produce pheromones? Well, we know that women do, and this has to do with regulating their menstrual cycle. Why would regulating your menstrual cycle, why would that be important? Why would that be important? Who cares? I mean, we don't like to talk about women's menstrual cycles anyway. We don't want to talk about women's menstrual cycles, right? You see it on the movies all the time. Men don't want to talk about it, okay? So why would that be important, that a woman has a regulated menstrual cycle? How in the world is she going to reproduce unless she has a regulated menstrual cycle? If her hormones are not functioning properly, if she's not releasing the proper amount of progesterone, the proper amount of all of the other menstrual hormones, then she can't reproduce. And this is one of the things that we notice with individuals that are, before they get married, before they start dating anybody, potentially they'll have a dysregulated menstrual cycle. And one of the reasons that we may be seeing, or we used to see more teenage pregnancies, is because we were trying to regulate people's menstrual cycles. Women were having such erratic menstrual cycles. Well, how in the world do you regulate somebody's menstrual cycle that isn't living in a dormitory with a lot of other women? Well, the way you do it is by giving the birth control pills. So what we were doing was we were regulating their hormones, their menstrual cycles, and we made them actually more fertile, as strange as that may seem. But there's another way that you can regulate a woman's menstrual cycle, and that is if she comes in contact with the male pheromone. So when she starts dating, her menstrual cycle will suddenly will regulate itself so that she can become pregnant. Now, if you think about the past, if you think about our anthropologic past, this was very important because women were not keeping all their pregnancies. They were not. Their children were not always surviving. Even wealthy people with all the medical facilities in the world, they were only able to produce, one out of every 3 children were dying. So they were only 2 out of every 3 children were living.
It's almost like the one that you talked about a while back with pigs and farmers,
right,
where the pigs give up a pheromone and the farmers kind of like deregulate their.
Exactly, and that was happening with the males. They weren't having nearly as much sex because they felt competitive against the pigs. And of course, pigs can put off all kinds of, as much pheromones as they want. You cannot compete with a boar because that boar has to reproduce with all those female pigs. So he's producing just tons and tons of pheromones, and so the male wasn't able to reproduce. So they were only having, they weren't having very many children. Pig farmers weren't. As weird as that seems, the pig farmers weren't having very many children. But now we've got another problem, and the problem has to do with sperm counts. Nobody realized how bad the sperm counts were. We start talking about sperm counts from 1973. Well, I started doing sperm counts in 1973. But we look at what the sperm counts were in 1973, and we look at what they are today. They're 60% less. 60% less. What was abnormally low in 1973 is now normal in 2018. Yeah. So what's the probability? We may lose the ability to make babies. Males aren't producing enough sperm to make babies. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, but we've seen a steady decline from 1973 to 2018 of 60% of the sperm that men were producing. Not only that, their ejaculate is less voluminous. In the old days, a normal ejaculation was anywhere between 5 and 10 cc's, which is fairly voluminous, but now if you have a 5 cc ejaculation, that's an oddity. It's copious. It's more than what is normally thought of. A lot of men only will ejaculate 1 or 2 cc's. Not only that, but the number of sperm that they have in each cc of semen is much less than it used to be. So whereas they might produce 1 billion sperm and ejaculate 1 billion sperm, now they're ejaculating, 200 or 300,000. 200, 300 million, I'm sorry. Anyway. We'll see what happens.
Could it be like a population, Amy?
It could be a natural thing. We're starting to be overpopulated, and since we're being starting to be overpopulated, we're naturally decreasing our ability to reproduce. But we may get ourselves into a situation where we're not able to reproduce. So pig farmers, on the average, were only having 2 or 3 kids before, and usually they were only having 2 or 3 kids at the beginning of their marriage. So they were having kids at the beginning of their marriage, but they couldn't reproduce after they had lived on the pig farm for an extended length of time. There were a lot of pig farmers that were not getting married. This is very common up in Minnesota, and they talk about the bachelor farmers of the Norwegian bachelor farmers of Minnesota. But it may have been because they were raising pigs and they didn't have the desire. It lowered their libido, as odd as that may seem.
We had to have the pigs mate elsewhere to board.